potential. Probably the most overused word when it comes to Formula One. A word with many roots and many meanings, but within a sporting context there is one clear definition: unrealised ability. For every Senna or Schumacher, you can find 10 to 20 others who historians and journalists will claim had the potential to equal, if not surpass, the long-standing legends of the sport, yet never did so. Within that gaggle of names, debates will sprout up over which of these potential greats was the biggest waste of talent. Some will say John Surtees, once comparable in talent levels to one of the all-time greats in Jim Clark, but whose Alonso-esque questionable career choices leave his one world title and handful of wins looking like a pittance. Others might moot a name like Johnny Herbert, once billed as a generational talent, but for whom superstardom was denied after a foot-shattering accident. Plenty other names will regularly crop up: the mercurial yet inconsistent René Arnoux, the fiery and self-destructive Juan Pablo Montoya, or a man with so many poles he makes Krakow look underpopulated in Charles Leclerc. All are worthy contenders for the title of F1's most wasted talent. All might fall short when compared to a man by the name of Jan Magnussen. If that name rings the faintest of bells, you may well be thinking of the more modern iteration of F1 Magnussen, Jan's son Kevin. Whilst we can debate just how successful Magnussen Jr.'s time in F1 was, the base statistics will tell you that there was a guy who has a pole position to his name, who remains Denmark's only podium finisher, and who has enjoyed a moderately successful turn in F1's midfield across nearly 200 races. And all of that is a lot more than Magnussen Sr. ever managed, and substantially less than what was anticipated. Triple world champion Sir Jackie Stewart, a man who had previously earmarked names like Rubens Barrichello and Dario Franchitti on his junior stairway of talent, ranked Jan above those and all others, decreeing that this guy was the greatest driving talent since Ayrton Senna. That's a declaration backed up by his son Paul, who stated that when it came to Magnussen, on pure speed the only one who comes close to Jan is Rubens, but on raw ability I would put Jan ahead of him. Jan had the potential to go beyond that. You really believed it. As you may have surmised, Jan Magnussen did not become a world champion like a Senna or a Surtees, or even a Grand Prix winner like the remainder of those in that wasted potential debate. For all the expectation and hyperbole around the Dane, his F1 career lasted a pitiful 25 attempts before being discarded to the sidelines at just 24 years old by the very same faces who had nurtured and guided him from the junior categories to the senior class of racing. Quite how such a driver offered so much potential and delivered so little is what we'll attempt to detangle today as we take a look at the maddening mysteries of Magnussen. As with so many young racing prodigies, Jan dazzled in karting, racking up regional, national and junior world karting championships. At 18, without much in the way of sponsorship, he made his own way to Britain to continue his motorsport education and was quickly winning races in Formula Ford and Formula Opel across the next 2 years. It wasn't just his rapid nature that was turning heads. Off-track, the maverick Magnussen stood out from the crowd, not unlike a Kimi Raikkonen or James Hunt figure. Against a backdrop of other aspiring drivers, all well-groomed, well-spoken model athletes, you had Jan, chain-smoking, gym-avoiding, dressed in the scruffiest overalls and with a personality that the journalist Andrew Benson recalled as shy and monosyllabic, but direct and engaging. It was a turn-off for prospective sponsors, but for the movers and shakers in racing circles, it was easy to look past outer appearances when it was clear that inside, as F3 team manager Andy Miller pointed out, was a spark that you just can't teach. It certainly helped catch the eyes of a pair of notable racing Scots. The Stewarts were comprised of the aforementioned pair of Sir Jackie and his racer-turned-manager son Paul. Across the 90s, the Stewart clan had ran teams across a variety of tiers on the motorsport ladder and employed many rising, latterly iconic names in that time. Montoya, Coulthard, De Ferran and Franchitti, to name but a few. After a couple of cameo races with them in 93, they took Jan on board for a crack at the 1994 British F3 Championship. This is the year for Magnussen which perhaps lives in the most infamy. Of the year's 18 races, he won 14 of them, besting a long-standing record from Senna and setting a standard that would never be matched in the remainder of the series' history, even despite latter years reaching upwards of 30 races. It upgraded his talent status from promising to generational, and prompted that notorious Senna comparison from Sir Jackie. Fittingly, it was Senna's old stomping partners McLaren who offered Jan his first F1 testing role the following year. With that came a contractual partnership with engine partners Mercedes, who had already guided the likes of Schumacher and Heinz-Harald Frentzen into the sport, and the Silver Arrows wasted no time in popping their shiny new toy into a variety of series to offer up some competitive experience. Across the next 2 years, he raced concurrently in the DTM and the International Touring Car Championship, finishing runner-up in the latter on his first attempt. By the end of '96, he was back in single-seaters, this time across the pond in the IndyCar scene, and impressing once more as he proved close to the pace of veteran teammates Al Unser Jr. and Paul Tracy. An avenue to America was offered to Magnussen, with the ever-successful Penske team presenting the possibility of a part-time program in '97, and a full year after that. We should have taken it, admits his manager David Sears, but Jan had always wanted to do F1. It's easily missed that Jan had in fact already done F1 by this point in time, for a one-off substitute appearance with McLaren. Shortly before the 1995 Pacific Grand Prix, regular driver Mika Häkkinen was sidelined with acute appendicitis, and test driver Magnussen was called up for his Grand Prix debut, making him the first Dane to start a Grand Prix in over 20 years. Unlike the appendicitis, there was nothing cute about the call-up. Contrary to the modern era where drivers undergo rigorous training and preparation, Jan was entering his debut race weekend on quite the back foot. The MP410B car was an uncompetitive, unloved beast, and despite Jan's position as test driver, he reflected, "The longest run I ever did was 4 laps. It was reported he'd only taken part in 7 short tests before the weekend, with no practice of starts or pit stops." Yet despite all of that, and on a tricky new circuit to boot, Magnussen gave a very positive first impression. He qualified a creditable 12th and, according to Murray Walker, drove like a veteran on race day, not putting a wheel wrong en route to 10th place, just over 2 seconds behind teammate Mark Blundell, a man starting his 61st Grand Prix that day. Walker declared Jan a star in the making and a man of the future. It was a sentiment echoed by those in the McLaren garage. Team boss Ron Dennis proclaimed it was an exceptionally good race, and Mercedes' Norbert Haug was of the opinion that Jan was very impressive and a real racer. Indeed, the only criticism to be found was from those asking why he hadn't had a crack at Blundell, to which Jan retorted, "I could have passed him, but I wanted to be seen as a safe pair of hands." By the end of the weekend, rumours began to circulate that McLaren were looking to place Magnussen at Arrows for the following year, to blood the Dane into the rigours of F1. Potentially a future move into a McLaren race seat could follow, an especially tantalising prospect when you consider the team would be world champions within the next 3 years. But no such moves came about, and Jan would spend 1996 on the outside of the F1 shop window, face firmly affixed to the glass. Thankfully for Jan, someone was waiting to let him in from the cold for 1997. Talks were held with the likes of Sauber and Jordan, both of whom had proven reputable spots for young talents to ply their trade before moving further up the field. But when the prospect of reuniting with the Stewarts, themselves about to embark on their maiden voyage into the F1 seas, was raised, there was only ever going to be one fitting choice. In May of '96, discussions were opened between the Scots and Magnussen over reuniting in the big leagues, and by October the remaining T's and I's were crossed and dotted. Jan Magnussen would be a full-time Formula One driver with a juicy 4-year contract. He displayed an outstanding talent in the formative classes of the sport, boasted Sir Jackie. I sincerely believe that he will be a good investment for us over the long term. Jan chimed in to state, "It's a real pleasure to be going back to the Stewart family, whose experience and professionalism I trust and respect. It is the challenge of a lifetime, and I will do my utmost to fulfill it." Pleasantries aside, it seemed quite the gamble. Other than nostalgia, it might have seemed hard to understand why a rookie navigating his first tentative steps into Formula One would join a team also taking those same stumbling steps. The recent record for new teams in the sport was hardly a ringing endorsement to the idea. Between '94 and '96, 3 outfits, Pacific, Simtech and 40, had entered F1, scarcely made a whimper, and promptly disappeared within 18 to 24 months. For all Stewart's lower league successes, one could gesture towards the pitfalls of the first of that new trio in Pacific. There was another operation that had also run rampant across the junior categories, and yet found their time in F1 conspicuously lacking in successfully qualifying for races, let alone scoring points. The message was clear: lower success does not equal the same in Formula One. What stood Stewart apart from these prior examples was how better prepared they were. There was the guiding hand of Sir Jackie, proclaimed by Stewart's other signing Barrichello as the best teacher you could have. Plastered across the car was no shortage of big bucks backing. The Malaysian government were providing plenty of ringgits to this team's coffers, with additional funds coming from brands like HSBC, Texaco and Sanyo. Beneath the hood, affixed with all those stickers, was an exclusive Ford Works engine, alongside a 5-year development deal with the American giants. And the team's first offering, which would roll out of their new factory in Milton Keynes, was penned by the experienced Alan Jenkins and ably assisted by a former junior of Adrian Newey, Iqbal Hamidi. Not to mention running on Bridgestone tyres, which offered a key edge of durability over those running Goodyear tyres. Put all that together, and it didn't matter that this was their first year. This was a team that could come out swinging. Despite that captivating collection of components, Stewart was still cautious when it came to their ambitions, stating their aim was to slowly establish themselves and build to a championship challenge in 2001. Others were less conservative. Some felt they had the potential to echo what had arguably been their last exceptional debut year from a team, Jordan in 1991, who had finished a fantastic 5th, and several others were happy to whisper that, with the quality of personnel and resources, race wins could be on the cards by 98, with a title bid following suit in 99. If that could come to pass, and with the security of his 4-year deal, then Magnussen had the prime position for a rise through the order not unlike a modern-day instance like Oscar Piastri. Not every year does a driver turn up in F1 who looks capable of making people sit up and pay attention, wrote the previews, but Magnussen has the skills to do just that. From that optimistic outlook, let's neatly segue to a few months down the line, August 1997 to be precise. Jan was now 12 races into his burgeoning F1 career, but rather than looking ahead to a long and winding road of success and good times, rumours were running rampant that Jan's 4-year contract would be hastily torn up before the year's end. His future hangs in the balance, grumbled the media. The young Dane has been a big disappointment this year. Other reports claimed that Stewart had warned Jan to up his game, that a young Montoya was waiting in the wings to jump in at a moment's notice, and that veterans like Jean Alesi and Gianni Morbidelli were positioning themselves to sidle into that same seat. Given he was not even a 5th of the way through his contract, it may seem exceedingly harsh that Magnussen was heading for the chopping block so early on, unless your name is Liam Lawson, in which case you might be wondering what was taking Stewart so long. But if you look at the base statistics of the season at this point, it makes it a little easier to understand. Remember that quip from Paul Stewart at the beginning? On raw ability, I would put Jan ahead of Rubens. And yet at this point in their teammate tussle, It was the Brazilian who boasted a shampoo-esque margin over the Dane, head and shoulders clear. The qualifying head-to-head was 10-1 in favour of Barrichello, with Rubens an average of 1.5 seconds ahead. Magnussen had yet to qualify higher than 15th, the other Stewart had been as high as 3rd. Sundays were little better, with his points tally at a conspicuous 0. From 11 races he had seen the checkered flag just twice. The seemingly sole highlight was his performance at Monaco, where he had navigated the double-trouble jeopardy of a wet race on the calendar's trickiest circuit to climb into the points by half distance, only to lock up, break his front wing and witness the resulting pit stop drop into an eventual 7th, just shy of his maiden points. Worse yet, it was an easily missed achievement, as Barrichello had caught all eyes on his way to a sensational 2nd place for Stewart's first ever points. But matters are never as simple as the black and white reality that statistics present. Yes, Jan had failed to finish 9 of those opening 11 races, but that was owing primarily to what would be Stewart Grand Prix's kryptonite in their debut year, exceedingly poor reliability. The SF01 proved liable to more breakdowns than me. Out of 34 possible race finishes across the entire calendar year, a Stewart car would only see the checkered flag on a paltry 6 occasions. The warning signs had been evident as early as pre-season testing, based on how little pre-season testing was actually conducted by the team. To call Stewart and Magnussen's mileage before Melbourne minimal would be putting it lightly. Arriving at his Grand Prix debut, Jan hadn't even run the 300 km average race distance yet. For comparison's sake, when Jacques Villeneuve had rocked up for his debut 1 year previously, he'd done over 13,000 kilometres of testing. With so little running behind the wheel, that disadvantage would go some way to explaining the qualifying chasm between himself and Rubens. Granted, the Brazilian had scarcely had more time in the car before one or several things all went boom, but at least he had 5 years worth of F1 experience to fall back upon, whereas Jan had scarcely 5 hours worth of mileage, not to mention readjusting to single-seaters after 2 years spent predominantly in touring cars. Lacking in comfortability and confidence, with all the pressure mounting on his shoulders, the one thing Jan just needed more than anything else, as David Tennant would put it, was time. Thankfully, the Stewarts were considerably less trigger-happy than those that would occupy those same Milton Keynes halls later down the line. In Jan's own words, I got miles in the car, got into a good rhythm. I got more and more comfortable, and I got to a point with my engineer where it started to work. Everything started to come together. Slowly but surely, a drip feed of evidence to support that statement began to build, with little hints to attest to his progress across the final third of the year. He ran as high as 4th in the early stages in Belgium, and followed that with a season's best qualifying of 13th in Italy. Austria was better yet, with a dizzying 2nd place in free practice, soon followed by an outstanding 6th in qualifying. He vaulted to 4th at the start, notably proving a bother to champion-to-be Villeneuve, and it was only a dash of inexperience in tyre management, a splash of poor pit-stop strategies from his team, and a large dollop of another engine failure that denied Magnussen his first points. More potential points went begging through no fault of his own at the Nürburgring, this time after the drive shaft sheared whilst in the battle for 6th. Whilst his year would end up like a blunt pencil, pointless, there was nothing dull about the manner in which he rounded out the year in Jerez, when he went and outqualified Barrichello for the first time on merit. It had taken longer than most had anticipated and required a bit of a wake-up call, but the tides were seemingly turning the way many had predicted. Chief Engineer Andy LaFleming recalls how Rubens had been used to not registering Jan on his radar, and all of a sudden Jan was going quicker. Rubens would pull his belts tighter, and then Jan would go quicker again, and we thought, my God, he's got it. We might have something here. It was something echoed by the Stewarts, who promptly saw fit to quash any further doubts over his future with the team, confirming their continuation with the Dane for 1998. As his 2nd season rolled about, there was every reason to be excited about Jan's prospects for the year ahead. The inexperienced, underprepared model that had started the year was a distant memory, supplanted by a fired-up and increasingly rapid version. Better yet, there was still more improvement to come. Magnussen had privately recognised his weakest points, such as fitness, and was determined to work hard to overcome them. "You won't recognise me next year," Jan told Le Fleming. "That's what we want," came the reply. Hopes were equally high from Stewart HQ. With key components like Ford, Jenkins and Bridgestone all remaining in place, and with a revolutionary carbon fibre gearbox in place, expectations were to not only be finishing the majority of races, but to be doing so in the points. And, whispered journalists, even getting into a position to have a crack at winning races should the top teams hit trouble. That second aspiration might have been a little too optimistic, but if both Magnussen and Stewart could continue their upward trend, then the prospect of regular points and a breakout year were far from a fanciful prospect. "He was so good in junior Formula," wrote James Allen. "Surely he must make good in Formula One." Once again, though, pre-season optimism and expectation stood at a stark contrast to reality. The gap between himself and Barrichello, which had been whittled down throughout the previous year, had reopened to a seconds deficit to the Brazilian. Nowhere was this drop in pace more noticeable than in Argentina, where he was last in qualifying, narrowly beating the 107% margin, and behind even he of wretched racing infamy, one Ricardo Rosset. In a sobering reminder of how perceptions in the F1 circle can flip faster than Mark Webber, by the time the Grand Prix circus reached the fourth round in Imola, the paddock was awash with reports that, like a calendar, Magnussen's days were numbered, with the out-of-work Jos Verstappen spotted in conversation with the Stewarts throughout the weekend. When another woeful qualifying left him mired near the back once again before calamitously colliding with Barrichello the next day, those whispers only grew. By the skin of his teeth, Magnussen clung on, saved by the combination of some excessive contract demands from Verstappen's management and a determination from the Stewarts to unlock Jan's potential. Still, the pressure was arguably now at its heaviest, with Jan allegedly driving on a race-by-race basis, and talks with Verstappen still rumbling in the background. In their infinite wisdom, the Stewarts decided to concoct a plan that would allow them to build up Magnussen's confidence so that, in Paul's words, he could perform with the same brilliance as he did in the junior formula. So how would one do that? An extensive testing program? Taking the time to sit down with Jan and his engineer to unlock what was going wrong? What they instead elected to do was one of F1's more infamous off-track moments, when Sir Jackie decided to take Jan to Alton Park for a quote-unquote driving lesson. It boosted Jan's confidence 100-fold, if by confidence we mean total humiliation. The senior Stewart was no slouch behind the wheel, even approaching 60, but as Jan astutely pointed out, driving an F1 car now was a touch different than those the Scot had driven a quarter of a century previously. If you want to try to build up a driver, you don't take him to Alton Park, force him to drive in a way that is unnatural to him, and then advertise the fact that you went faster, grumbled Jan some years later. Shockingly, the power of patronisation failed to generate an overnight change in Jan. The results continued to glaringly not come, and the only bright spot to be found across the first 7 races of the year was to be found in Canada, the 7th of those Grand Prix, where Magnussen finally scored his first point at the 25th time of asking. But even the bright spot had a dull tint to it, for it had been a 6th place finish from just 9 finishers, and those he beat to the final point included the aforementioned and rubbish Rosset, the much-maligned Minardi of Shinji Nakano, a man for whom Anonymous would constitute the highest of praise. "I felt I was back on form," Jan quipped, but suffice to say not many others shared that same feeling. Nearly a fortnight after Canada, Verstappen jumped into the Stewart for a test at Magny-Cours. Though his best lap was a second off the pace of Barrichello, crucially, as was quipped in a report of the time, his lap times were not that great, but the feedback was. On the 20th of June, it was announced that Magnussen had been dropped and replaced by Verstappen with immediate effect. He was struggling to adapt to F1, reflected Sir Jackie. The blunt reality was that part of each team's income was and remains based on the number of points earned, so both drivers needed to deliver for sound financial reasons, and that wasn't happening. In contrast to that formality, Jan's appraisal on the situation was as blunt as ever. They're making a change for the sake of it to show they're trying something, and it's in the wrong area. Given Jos failed to score a point in his 9 appearances and was outqualified 1-8, Jan might have been on to something there. There can be little doubt too that Jan was a victim of matters beyond his control, with pressure being applied from other sources onto the Stewarts, which in part forced their hand and prompted Jan's dismissal. Early on in '98, the Stewart-Ford relationship was looking pretty strained after such a glaring lack of results across the previous year and the start of the new, and paddock whispers suggested Ford representative Martin Whitaker had been meeting with Benetton team manager David Richards about the American giants switching their support to their old partners, with whom they had a history of success. The Stewarts were desperate to salve those wounds, and amidst the start of negotiations over the sale of the outfit to Ford for what would become Jaguar, Ford were placing an increasing amount of pressure on the team. When Whitaker urged the pair to ditch Magnussen in favour of Verstappen in the hopes that a more proven and experienced candidate in the second car would lead to a more cohesive lineup and subsequent upturn in form, the Scots' hands were tied. Potential was a no-good quantity for a results-driven monolith like Ford. Jan has echoed those feelings over Ford's sway. I was the first one of many people to be let go. A week later it was the designer Jenkins, and in the end, except for Jackie and Paul, just about everyone else got fired. There is of course the argument that if Jan had continued on that upward momentum that he had showcased towards the tail ends, then none of this would have happened, and there would be no need for a Stewart or Ford to make considerations for alternate candidates. So what was it that caused Jan's upward curve to come to a more sudden halt than a Piastri behind a safety car? The most obvious piece of evidence would simply be the car. Barrichello, who would go on to drive some horrible Hondas and woeful Williamses down the line, still reflects on the SF02 as probably the worst car I've ever driven. Partly this was owing to the myriad of problems the team had faced throughout '97, and whilst those gremlins were being worked out, the development of the SF02 increasingly became more and more of an afterthought. Another issue arose when the FIA, in their infinite wisdom, introduced a last-minute addendum to the regulation over the winter of '97, forcing teams to revert from slicked to groove tyres. Teams now had to navigate a sudden drop in grip levels, and according to Sir Jackie, the larger, richer teams could afford to make the adjustments and find speed elsewhere. It was much more difficult for teams like us. The result was the very late production and limited pre-season testing schedule of the new car, which was unsurprisingly filled with more things going wrong than right. It was a complete shitbox, reflects Le Fleming, and when you've got a bad car, it is the young, inexperienced guys that suffer. As we had seen with his latter improvements, he needed time in the car, and if he was to continue that rate of improvement, he needed machinery at an equivalent, if not better level. Instead, he received something with marginally better reliability and infinitely more problems to work through. Nobody knew what direction to go in, recalls Jan. It was a great shame for Jan to leave Stewart when he did, for if he'd been able to hang on for just one more year, he would have got his mitts on what would have been the most competitive F1 machinery he'd ever touch. At the launch of the Stewart SF3, Sir Jackie boasted, "With this car, I believe that if circumstances are favourable to us, we would win a race." And those words would prove prophetic when Johnny Herbert, who had replaced Verstappen in the Stewart lineup, would navigate the chaos of that year's European Grand Prix to claim Stewart's first and only Grand Prix win. And it wasn't just a one-off turn of speed, as Barrichello regularly contended at the pointy end of things that year, as Stewart hit the fringes of the leading pack. With more competitive machinery, could Magnussen have got on to bigger and better things? Or would his struggles just continue in earnest at a more noticeable and inexcusable plateau? The likes of Le Fleming certainly feel the former option is more likely, stating that if he'd had some marvellous machinery beneath him from the get-go, things would have been quite different. If somehow Jan had got a Williams drive in '97 or something, I think he'd be a bloody star. Instead, at just 24 years old, Jan's F1 dream was over. Returning home to Denmark, he strongly considered packing in racing altogether, and then manager Sears rang to inquire about testing the Panos sports car in the US. Suffice to say, that test reawakened Jan. It was such a weird, wonderful car. I felt a good sense of team spirit, good people around me. I felt that people wanted me there. Subsequently, Magnussen has rebuilt his reputation as one of the world's best sports car drivers. He is a two-time IMSA sports car champion, a two-time American Le Mans Series class champion, a four-time class winner at Le Mans 24 Hours, a class winner at Daytona, a multiple Danish touring car champion, and with more triumphs to boot. The versatility, success and speed he has shown is only soured by those that ponder what could have been had that same level been translated in F1 circles. Once billed the greatest driving talent since Senna, the maddening mystery of Magnussen would have you ponder whether Sir Jackie might have inadvertently been referring to Bruno rather than Ayrton. Never has a driver shown such dominance and ability in the lower categories, and yet performed at such a polar opposite level in Formula 1. Why was that the case? In my opinion, this is not a matter of another junior starlet's plateauing or simply not being good enough. Quite the opposite, in fact. Simply put, Jan Magnussen was too fast for his own good. It may sound backwards, but one of the worst things that happened to the Dane was winning the '94 British F3 title at the absolute canter that he did. It all came to me so easily, so naturally, says Jan. It wasn't something I had to work at. I thought this was how my whole career was going to be. It was a naivety that only grew when a 21-year-old was compared to the very recently departed Senna, and swelled only further when his first F1 cameo continued to bring forth praise and predictions of championship glory. The biggest mistake I made, he reflects, was relying on what I perceived to be my natural talent. It is perhaps as overused a phrase as that of potential, but it's true what they say, talent will only get you so far, and the tale of Jan Magnussen is living proof of that. Unaccustomed to the concept of failure, he neglected any other form of development. He naturally assumed he could plug in and play when it came to Formula 1, and that proved a fatal flaw. Rather than someone with an understanding of where to improve and to adapt, Dennis reflects on Magnussen as someone who never seemed to know why he wasn't quick. Simply put, he underestimated F1 and what was required of him. It was not simply about just driving quickly, it was understanding how to go beyond that deep-rooted level of natural talent. There were aspects to the game he simply didn't develop the skills for. There was no technical understanding of how to improve or develop a car, because he'd never needed to know such things. Many adjudge a large part of his Stewart struggles because of this particular flaw, a statement that Jan has said is not completely incorrect. Alongside that are the elements that perhaps such a unique character as Magnussen was always doomed to be stuck in contrast with, that of the politics and the commerciality within the world's most cutthroat sport. With a 4-year contract in his back pocket within an outfit he was previously acquainted with, there was perhaps a sense of resting upon his laurels and failing to recognise just how vulnerable an F1 drive can become, even surrounded by those you've enjoyed ample success elsewhere with. And whilst a scruffy, chain-smoking, Raikkonen-esque figure stands as a cult hero for lovers of racing, it also sharply contrasts against the fitness-focused image-is-everything world that F1 was becoming. Jan was never going to attract good attention from other teams, sponsors, or even the incoming forward upheaval within Stewart. Coupled with a lack of results, it explains the glaring disinterest from any other teams after his exit from Stewart. Though Jan had his weaknesses, perhaps the saddest part is that even if he had realised it sooner, his opportunities for development were very limited by those outfits he aligned with. With McLaren, there are murmurings to suggest maybe Jan should have stuck around there a touch longer, in his words, to have all the things I didn't have hammered into me. It's a reflection easy to make with the power of hindsight. Nowadays, young guns run through an enormous gauntlet of rigorous, meticulous preparations and procedures to prepare them for a potential graduation. But in the late 90s, there was nothing like that, or at least not at McLaren. Jan has drawn the parallels between what was available to him and what was available for Kevin on his McLaren debut in 2014. For any situation, any question, there's a guy to go to, someone to teach him, reflected Jan. And in my time, there was no coaching, no teaching the ropes. There was just me. Stewart perhaps could have or should have been that nurturing environment that allowed him to excel. For all the boasting the Stewarts have made over their self-proclaimed staircase of talent developing young drivers, it was instead the least conducive scene for a rookie racer. Rotten reliability, with 12 of his 17 retirements being of a mechanical nature, denying him time to acclimatise to the sport and to the car. and though he began to turn a corner towards the end of the first year, progress was then swiftly halted by a mountain of issues the following year that the Danes simply didn't have the technical experience to handle. The Stewarts favoured, understandably, his teammate, with updates and new parts heading to the Brazilian first. What was less understandable was their attitude to understanding the gap between the two. If I'm slower than him, the team must realise why, recalls Jan. But it didn't work like that. Instead, Stewart saw only the base statistics and failed to meaningfully assist their previous protege. Painful as it is, the blame goes both ways. If no one could help him, and in the Stewarts' instance there is an argument they had enough to juggle without adding that support into consideration, then Jan needed to help himself, and he simply didn't. In close racing circles, Jan is often remembered by those who worked with him as, more or less, the same guy who was spotted all those years ago in Formula 3. Rapid in a car, disorganised, messy, mismanaged out of it. So Jackie Stewart declares Magnussen as someone with very poor mind management, which was very disappointing when you consider the level of natural talent he had been blessed with. Dennis, with ample candidates from over 50 years' involvement in the sport, has called Jan the most disorganised Grand Prix driver I've ever known. In one notorious incident between the pair at an airport, Jan had to open his suitcase to hunt for a lost passport. It looked like it had been packed by a 4-year-old, said Ron. People like that are chaotic in their thinking, and I thought there's no way he's going to make it. But for all the criticism from the likes of myself, Dennis, Stewart, and more, none have a harsher reflection on this maddening mystery than Magnussen himself. I let myself down, and that always hurts. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider pulling into the pit box of my channel, bolting on the tyres of hitting that subscribe button, and tearing off the fresh visor of hitting the like button. I've had word from the pit wall that it's the best strategy available for you.